All right, we're going to talk about architectural facades and their proportion and shape. So you're wondering, what is a facade? If you don't know what it is, a facade is the face of a building. Most of our buildings on campus are going to have some consideration paid to the face of the building. Now, that doesn't mean that every building, every structure that you see the facade is really that important or maybe hadn't been considered. But oftentimes you'll find that many provincial public buildings will have a facade that's maybe decorated in a certain way or is the face of the building. But regardless, you're familiar with what a facade is. You've seen it before. And here are some residential and some commercial examples of a facade. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the proportions that exist within a facade. So windows, doors, roofs, things like that aren't just placed arbitrarily. Their proportion, how big are the windows compared to the entire face of the building, is really under heavy consideration because when they're not placed in the right way, things just seem off. So remember what proportion is. It's the size of something compared to another element within itself. So in a composition, it might be how big is one object compared to itself, or on me personally, how big is my head compared to the rest of my body? How thin is my waist compared to how tall I am? How big are those windows compared to how tall is the two-story building we're looking at? So in this Mediterranean revival structure here, if we break it down, if we throw a line through the center of the building and then a line through the center of the left and right two windows, you'll notice that the space on the ends is smaller than the space in between the middle window and the side windows. And so the little shape that I've placed there sort of represents it. You can see that the space is narrower from the center of the window to the side of the building than the center of the window to the middle of the building. Well, this isn't a new idea. If you look at the Acropolis, you're probably looking at it and say, yep, those columns are equally spaced. Well, no, they're not. And if you look even closer here, I'll zoom in once again, you'll notice that the last two columns are a little bit closer to the one next to them than all the rest. And if I zoom in one more time, you'll notice, and it's even easier to tell when you see the space in between the capital here is smaller than the space right here. And what this does is it keeps the structure from sort of floating off the edges. And also these columns are, what helps is that they're pitched inward a little bit. You notice that they're kind of pitched up. But they're closer. So the space here is closer than the space right here. Well, if we look at an old farmhouse, here's a farmhouse in Gage, Nebraska, photographed by someone named Farm Boy, found it online. If we do the same thing, the same diagram, we throw a line through the center, throw a line through the center of that window, and then a line down the edge of the building. It's quite obvious that this space is bigger than this space. And whoever built this building, wasn't just putting together a structure and they said, well, they had only so much wood, and they weren't so pragmatic that they weren't considering classic architecture. And classical architecture here, it's very obvious to me that this person was a high craftsperson. They understood proportion, especially, amongst other things, within a 3D structure. Same thing here with the layout. The windows, the three windows are the most important part of this house. They're sort of the eyes of the house in a way. And so the space given for that area is slightly larger than the space given for the porch and for the roof line, excluding the pediment, which is a little bit bigger, but we'll get to that in a minute. When talking about proportion, you should also consider how big are the elements And then how about the negative space? So you guys know what negative space is. Here we can maybe kind of take the term and alter it a little bit. The space that is not the windows, so the clapboard in our case here. So if I take these white rectangles and fill in the windows with those, I can turn those rectangles on their side, and the space in between those two is equidistant. So you could probably find lots of elements that fit into one another in a structure like this on a facade. So the layout, basically this goes back to the graphic layout. And this is why I had you go back and use your graphic layout, hopefully as a way to create an interesting architectural space. So if you're considering how do elements fit into one another, this is a good example, I feel like. So this brings me to the next point, the shapes that you see on a facade. The shapes are just as important, if not more important maybe, than the proportions. After all, it's the shapes that we're considering the proportion of compared to the entire building, right? So this shape, a triangle, you've seen it on the front of many, many buildings. It's called a pediment. And it could also be called a gable end of a roof. In our case here, it's both. The pediment means it's on the front of the house, on the facade of the house. But also this contains a roof above it, so it's both a gable and a pediment. Well, you've seen it other places like on the White House and once again on the Acropolis. So the idea of a pediment, it's classical architecture. Of course, the White House is a Greek revival, so why wouldn't they have columns and pediments? But you've seen pediments other places too, on other buildings. You'll probably notice them around campus as well. Well, pediments aren't reserved for roofs or the very tippity top of the building. Pediments exist above doorways and windows. And if you look on a crispy dollar bill, I think you'll see that there are alternating pediments above the windows on the first floor of the north portico of the White House. So when there's a great exchange of power, President Bush is on his way out, President Obama is on his way in, yours truly is noticing the classical architecture in the background. Probably should be paying attention to these guys, but I'm interested in what I'm interested in. Well, you see there are triangles in the front of this house. Here are the pediments that are above. Well, also in the White House and many other facades, you also see arches. So arches are another probably fairly dominant half-circle arch shape that you see on the front of a building, on a facade of a building. And here's an example of an arched doorway. And the last shape, and we're speaking in broad generalities here, but are rectangles. And here's an example of a really long rectangle. These are called pilasters. So pilasters are like columns, but they actually don't hold anything up. They're just basically there for decoration. And oftentimes they're next to an arch. So here are some pilasters on the front of a building, federal building of some sort, and you can see that this building contains arches, but mainly rectangles. That's the dominant shape feature of this building. The building is very square, in fact. There are no triangles in this one. Your job with this next assignment is to look for the shapes, the triangles, the arches, or the rectangles, and figure out how they relate to one another in terms of their proportion.